able assistant today. And all right, so we are being recorded. Sharon is helping out today by sharing the screen from her end, because that way that seems to work better than trying to transmit everything through the library system. So we will begin. This is a case study today, which was inspired in large part by a presentation this last April at one of our regular monthly meetings by Jesse Casas. I hope I've got your last name pronounced correctly, Jesse. Who is, I'm very grateful that he is joining us today, and hope that he finds it of interest. I consulted with him somewhat on putting this together, and he gave me some very useful suggestions. And so hopefully those were enough to improve it to a level that it will be interesting and informative. Basically, what I'm going to be talking about is when you have folks in your family who are what we might call brick walls, people that are unidentified, that we don't know who they actually were. And traditionally, we may lack enough records to be able to find them sufficiently, but using DNA gives us a much expanded source of information that we can use to kind of hone in on those ancestors. So I'm going to present a step-by-step approach. If Sharon can give me the next slide, please. This is the outline. First of all, we'll give you a background to the situation that I was researching and a formal problem statement, which the genealogists that I read and read about always say that in your research, you need to specify your problem statement. Then the early DNA matches that I've had once I had my DNA tested, that kind of began to point toward being able to find this individual I was looking for. But then I had to work forward from the common ancestor to find the person who fit in a more recent era. Jesse's problem, if I remember the specifics correctly, were that his father was adopted and he was looking for his father's parents. This goes back quite a bit further, as you will see. But working forward, you get a lot of possibilities and you need to narrow those with some eligibility criteria and then narrow it down enough so that you can come to some sort of a conclusion. Next slide, please, Sharon. There we go. So I'm going to begin with the background and also a problem statement. What I'm calling the background is basically describing the context in which this genealogical problem arose. And one way to organize the information is to think of the journalistic 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, and why. Writing those out so that you can really begin to focus. And from that, you can develop a problem statement that's clear and succinct. Slide, please. So in this case, the who was my great-grandmother, Laura Jane Morgan. She was born out of wedlock. That's the what. The when was 1870. And the where was Macon County, North Carolina. And you're going to see where that is in a minute as I have a map. When I get to the why, the question involving the why is, she was born out of wedlock. Was that a result of a consensual relationship or was it a coercive situation? We always have to leave that as a possibility, much as we would like to think that things like that don't happen. Could have been an incestual relationship. It could have been rape. It could have been some sort of domestic violence or other abuse. We don't know what the circumstances were, but the fact is that her mother did not reveal who the father was. So that's kind of why that's kind of a question. So next slide, please. So beginning the context, Jane's, I'm just going to call her Jane's mother, was Elizabeth Adeline Roper, and I'm going to refer to her as Adeline, which is the name she uses most times. She was born in 1843 and lived her entire life in Macon County, North Carolina. Next slide, please. There's a map of North Carolina and all of its counties, and the red one there is Macon County. This is in Appalachia. It is mountainous, it's ski country to some degree. Right above that part of North Carolina is the edge of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. It's an area with significant amounts of poverty, with low education levels. My great-grandmother never went to school, and it's also in the Bible Belt. So those are some of the factors to be aware of in dealing with what we're going to be looking at. Next slide, please, Sharon. So here's Adeline again, and she married a man by the name of George Morgan in 1860. She had a son by him in September of 1861, and then George enlisted into the Civil War. He joined the 7th Battalion of the North Carolina Cavalry, which of course was a Confederate unit, in July of 1862. George died on August 1st in 1863 in a battle in Tennessee. You will parenthetically find family trees online that identify George as the father of Jane Morgan, even though he had died 7 years previously, so that's very unlikely. He also had a son, Joseph, who was born October 1863. So that is a posthumous child born 2 months after his father had already passed away. So what do we have here is a widow with a 2-year-old and a newborn, and she is about 20 years old. So what she ended up doing was then moving back in with her mother, and she didn't marry again for another 7 years after Jane was born. But somehow along the way, as the next slide, please, will show, she had a child, a girl, Laura Jane Morgan, my great-grandmother, who was born September 21st, 1870. No father was named, and we don't know the circumstances by which this pregnancy occurred. In North Carolina, they have published, or I should say, they have a very robust, the archives has a very robust collection of records from what they call the bastardy court. Apparently most states have this kind of requirement back in that day, at least. The idea was that you did not want to have a child become a public charge. You wanted to make sure that the mother, if the child's born out of wedlock, that the mother could provide one way or another, either through her own family or in some other way, to make sure that child was taken care of. In this case, it required a bond to be posted, and it was by a neighbor and friend and a man who had served in the same unit with Adeline's husband, George Morgan. But the father was not named. And that was, of course, not too unusual either, despite the fact that there were usually considerable pressures put upon the woman to identify the father. So again, he would then be charged with taking care of his offspring. So this is the, yes, this is the situation. So I was going to ask if anybody could guess what the problem statement was. That's okay. This is how I framed it. The problem statement is, who was Jane Morgan's father? That's what we're trying to find out in our research. Now I can have the next slide, please, Sharon. So the first step of this process was to find some DNA matches. The DNA, as I said, provides some clues, information that is not otherwise available. The DNA, of course, does not lie or keep secrets the way people do. And when you have your DNA tested, there is, you get back a list of people whose DNA matches at least part of yours. They don't match all of it, of course, because that would only be you. It's unique. I had my DNA tested in November of 2014 for the first time. Now I want to give you a caution. The next slide contains some technical terms, which I'm going to define and describe for you, but get ready for that. Now we can have that next slide, please. So I tested at the Family Tree DNA, which is one of the 3 or 4 biggest testing sites, in November of 2014. And 3 years later, working my way through the several thousand actually matches, I came across a match with Patrick. I'm only going to use first names today because the people I'm going to talk about are all still living. So for their privacy, that's how they will be identified. This match was at 25 centimorgans, and it was on chromosome 2. So let me just define the terms in red. A centimorgan is a genealogical term, actually, that is more or less a measure of how closely you relate to somebody. It actually measures probabilities, but basically you can think of it as how close am I to this person? How much do I match? Total in your entire genome that is tested, and DNA tests for genealogy do not test every single gene. They focus on those that change frequently. If we have genes, say, that mandate that we have 2 legs, pretty much everybody is going to be born with that. So that is not helpful in distinguishing people and people's ancestors from people who are not their ancestors. But there's enough DNA there that it amounts to about 7,000 centimorgans. So if you have matched somebody with 70 centimorgans, that's about a 1% match. And that's actually fairly big. 25 centimorgans puts you back more in the range of about a 4th or 5th cousin. The chromosome, of course, most of you have heard of 23andMe, which is one of the testing services. It refers to the fact that there are 23 pairs of chromosomes in the human body, in each cell in the nucleus. 22 are called autosomes. You don't need to know that, but there is one pair that is an XY. Women have 2 X's, men have an X and a Y. So that inheritance works slightly differently, particularly for males. But the rest of it focuses on the other 22 sets, one basically from each parent. Then I mentioned that with Patrick, I found that in this genetic location on the 2nd chromosome, they number them by how long they are. The longest one's number 1, and the shortest one is number 22. There were really no other matches in my match list in that location on chromosome 2. Again, the shared match means you have somebody who also has DNA in the same area on a particular chromosome. But most of these services do have a mechanism by which you can contact your matches. Some of them are directly by email. which is what, if I remember right, Family Tree does. Some of them use a third, sort of an intermediary, pardon me, Ancestry does that. So you send them a message through the Ancestry system. See anything else I was going to comment here? One caution is that matching someone's DNA does not tell you how you are related to that person. We have birth certificates that identify which parents you had and who they were. DNA doesn't carry information like birth certificates do, but they do identify that we are related in some way, and it specifies that way using a length measurement on a particular genetic location. So using the communication system from Family Tree DNA, I sent Patrick an email, and back came, because I was curious. I mean, he's in a section where I have nobody else matching. And he wrote back and said that he was from Macon County. So that got me very, very excited, as you might think. So next slide, please. So in November 2018, I uploaded my DNA results to MyHeritage. Now, DNA results are stored as a digital file, so you don't have to take a second test. You can upload that file to a different DNA service for a very small fee, much less than taking a test. And it's the same DNA. Your DNA basically doesn't change. And then that gives you a whole new group of people to match with, people that have taken or forwarded their DNA to that particular service. So I uploaded my DNA results to MyHeritage at that point, which turns out to have about 3 times as many matches, at least for me, as Family Tree. And it also has some other tools available. So up came a match with Nancy. And her match was almost 32 centimorgans. So it was a little higher than Patrick's. And it turns out that it was in exactly the same location as Patrick. Next slide, please. So here we are. These numbers are basically genetic addresses. They refer to specific proteins in each chromosome has its own set of addresses, but you can see from these numbers that they're very, very similar. So, I mean, 142 million versus 146 million, and 171 million versus 170 million. That's the beginning and that's the ending. So obviously, Patrick and Nancy share this DNA, which also is the same DNA that I share with each of them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have shown up as a match at all. So the next question becomes, who is the ancestor that they share in common? Next slide, please. So tracing their family trees back from the information they provided and using traditional research, I was able to learn that both of them descend from Elizabeth Caroline Deweese. 1827, she was born, and she died sometime after 1900. Now, Caroline, I'll call her Caroline, had 2 husbands. One was Edward Wilson, whom she married in 1850, and Edward was Nancy's ancestor of the 2 that I matched with, Nancy and Patrick. Anderson Davis, who was the second husband, was the ancestor of Patrick. So that told me that she was their common ancestor. And usually you have common ancestors that are a couple, great-grandma and great-grandfather. But in this case, since she had 2 different husbands, and both of them, Nancy and Patrick, matched me, it was Caroline's mother's DNA that was getting passed down. That's kind of useful information to know. So next slide, please. Now the vendors have search tools, all of them do. And most of the time you can search not only for other matches, but you can search for surnames that might be in people's family trees that are posted on that website. Or sometimes, like Family Tree asks for a list of surnames, and you can search those. So Caroline DeWeese was the daughter of Henry DeWeese and Elizabeth Betsy, they called her, Wild. They were both born about 1800 in North Carolina. So now I'm looking for DeWeese and also Wild. In fact, I know that it's Wild, which is the source of this DNA, but I'm also related to the DeWeese line, as you will see. And I have a chart coming up in a couple slides that might make this a little more clear. Let's go to the next slide, please. Then all of a sudden, I got a third match. It is now December 2018, so that's 4 years after my original test. And of course, I'm working on hundreds of other ancestors at the same time. But this one really excites me because it's kind of a brick wall and it's fairly close. I'm looking for a great-great-grandfather. So the third match was Barbara. Same chromosome, same location. But now, this is how I know that it's the Wild DNA, because she was not a DeWeese. Her ancestor was Betsy Wild's brother, John Henry. So if we could have the next slide, please, that might make this a little clearer. So going way back, we have Hans Jacob Wild, who came from Switzerland, and Christine Stevely. They had a bunch of kids. The two that I'm particularly interested in are Betsy on the left and John Henry on the right, who's in the third column. Betsy's child was Caroline DeWeese, remember, with the woman with the two husbands, and I have shown both of them here, going downward toward Patrick in the first column and toward Nancy in the second column. Patrick and Nancy are half third cousins. But out here on the third side, we have Barbara, who's descended not from Caroline, but from John Henry. He is a fourth cousin of the other two, and they are all, as am I, descended from Hans Jacob Wild and Christine Stevely. So now I have pinpointed a likely line to pursue to identify who that mysterious great-grandfather was, because I know that he has to be somewhere in the line with these folks. So now let's go to the next slide. Are there any questions about that before I move on? Everyone's totally lost. Okay, we'll continue. Thanks, Sharon. So since then, I've continued to search and I have found a bunch more matches. I have at least 6 more DeWeese matches, and they match in various different chromosomes, depending on how far back. These matches go back to well into the 1700s with some of the original immigrants. On the DeWeese side, which were from, they were from Sweden. I think the Wilds were from Holland, if I remember which one was which. I found a couple more in the Wild line, again matching on chromosome 2. And when I actually ended up testing at Ancestry.com, which was just a year or so ago, I had many more DeWeese matches there. Unfortunately, Ancestry does not provide what we call a chromosome map. It just says, well, you've got a match with this person and it's X number of centimorgans, but it doesn't tell you which one of those 22 pairs of autosomes you match on. So the triangulation that I just described with he matches me and she matches me and they match each other, you can't accomplish very well using Ancestry, which is why I like the other 2 services better. But more matches are continuing to come. So Now it's time to use some traditional genealogy to work the descendants forward from Caroline's parents, Henry and Betsy DeWeese, and see who I can find that might be a candidate to be that elusive great-grandfather. Luckily, we're only talking about a couple of generations here, because when you start moving forward and being inclusive to capture every descendant on every line, and some of these are pretty good sized families, you end up with a lot of people. But I only had to go 2 generations deep, so it wasn't so bad. So we can have the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to start with these common ancestors, Henry and Betsy. And if you remember from the chart, they were the 2 that were Caroline's parents. She was shown in red. So now we're going to use the traditional genealogy resources and skills to trace forward. And again, using all the descendants as possibilities. Next slide, please. So there are 4 basic steps that I followed in my research here. Number 1 was to establish some eligibility criteria. What kind of person was I looking for? Number 2 would be to identify likely candidates that meet some or more or all of those eligibility criteria, if you will. Number 3 would be to compare the likely candidates. And number 4 was to analyze the findings and try to identify the most likely candidate from that list. So let's start with the next slide then. First of all, of course, the person had to be male. We're again looking for the great-grandfather. So that had to be male, had to be probably born 1825 to 1855, because I kind of narrowed down and said in 1870, when Jane was born, her father was probably somewhere between 15 at the low end and probably not much more than 45 on the high end. Adeline, remember, was a young mother at the time that Jane was born. She was only 27. So I did eliminate some potential older men, but they seemed less likely to be involved. The location, again, of course, was Macon County, but I didn't limit it just to Macon County and included families within this group that lived in nearby counties, because there was some out migration into other parts of the area. Although remember, this is a mountainous area, so they didn't go very far. On the other hand, once they got there, they didn't come back very often. And lastly, I did not exclude married men. So the marital status was not an eligibility criteria. I did not limit it to just single males. So we can have the next slide, please. So after I traced all the descendants of Henry and Betsy forward, at least to 1870, and eliminated those males who were too old or too young or had moved away and unlikely to be involved, I ended up with 7 males that fit the basic criteria of both age and location. So that was a very easy number to work with. And I found that 2 of them, I couldn't find them after 1860. And I suspect they were probably Civil War casualties. I didn't find a service record for them, but they also were not in the 1870 census. So they were probably not in the picture. 2 were living in Cherokee County, North Carolina, which is the next county over, the next county over in North Carolina toward the west. And the one was living in Gilmer County, Georgia, which sounds like, oh, that must be very far. But if you remember the map, Macon County is right on the line. That below that line is Georgia, and Gilmer County is 2 counties away from Macon. So a batch of them moved down there, and one of them was of the right age to have been possibly included in my sample. So I left them in at the beginning, but that only left me 2 more, and both of them were still living in Macon County in 1870. So this looked like the 2 that I really wanted to focus on as the most likely candidates to have been Jane's father. And so we can now move forward. Next slide. So the 2 that I found most likely that fit both age and location were Henry Davis and Enos Deweese. Henry Davis, who is no relative of mine in terms of the Davis, because there are Davises all over the place, and none of my Davises actually came through this part of the country. But Henry was born in 1848, and he was Henry and Betsy's grandson. He was the son of the oldest child in their family, who married a Davis. He lived in Burningtown Township in 1870 and happened to live right next door to Enos, the other of the 2. And Henry married at about 1866. So he was married at the time that Jane would have been conceived, which by my calculation is around Christmas in 1869. That may have had a factor in the event. The other man is Enos Deweese, who was the youngest son of Henry Deweese and Betsy Wild. He was born in 1843, and he was living next door to Henry at the time. And the interesting thing here is that he's actually Henry's uncle, even though he was only 5 years older, because he was the last of the Deweese children. And he was married in 1865, so he too was married at the time that Jane was conceived. So next slide, please. So now the step 4 is to analyze these findings. So one of the criteria was location, and I wanted to see in particular where these 2 men were in relationship to where Adeline was living. Both, it says past and present, it was both in 1870 and also before that. So I went back to 1850, and Adeline was living in a township called Tennessee Valley Township. Henry was living that year in Burningtown. Enos was also in Tennessee Valley Township, the same as Adeline. In 1860 and 1870, all 3 were in Burningtown Township. And I'm not sure if that was I mean, clearly there may have been some changes in boundaries there, but they were all living close to each other in 1860 and 70. And one last little note, in 1870, Enos sold his land in June and moved to Gilmer County, Georgia, that place that I mentioned earlier. Henry continued to stay in Macon County. And the second major criteria, the age. Henry was 5 years younger than Adeline. Enos was the same age. So there was a little closer fit there. And by looking at the marital status, it ended up that both were married at the time. So which one do you think is the most likely candidate given this? Next slide, please. I analyzed the comparison and looked at the age. Enos was the same age as Adeline. Henry was 5 years younger. And the location in 1850, when Adeline and Enos would have been 7 years old, they were both living somewhat near each other in the same township. Henry was 5 years younger, was living in a slightly different location. So the conclusion that I came to, and you can think for yourselves here, is on the next slide. Due to the fact of the proximity of the age and the location, Adeline probably knew Enos. We know that she knew him longer and perhaps better than she did Henry. And in my opinion, the weight of the evidence points to Enos DeWeese as the most likely father of Laura Jane Morgan. This is not proof. It is my conclusion after looking at all of the DNA evidence, which points to both of these men and a whole bunch of other people, and the genealogical evidence from various traditional records that kind of separate the two in terms of likelihood. So I have concluded that Enos is at least for the moment, is my great-great-grandfather. And when I put his information into Ancestry as part of my family tree, I get a whole bunch more DeWeese matches, including some of his children. So I think I'm probably on the right track. Again, I want to have a disclaimer. This is not proof, but some might consider it proof to a genealogical standard. And if we have the last slide, please. This is Enos Julius DeWeese, probably in his late 50s. The beard is white. He's beginning to bald. And it looks like that's probably about the age that he would have been. You will see he's holding a book that is a Bible. He was an elder in the church. I believe it was a Baptist church. Most of the churches in that area were Baptist churches. And so the question then becomes, if in fact this is the man, or no matter who the man was, why didn't Adeline reveal who this was, who the father of her child born out of wedlock was, so that she could get some perhaps support from him for her child, their child? Was it because the father, if it is indeed Enos, was, and I don't know if he was an elder, but clearly he was active in his church. So he had a religious bent, as many people in that area did. Was it because he was married? Or was it because of the circumstances of how the pregnancy came about? And the answer to that question is, we'll never know. But for my money, this is a picture of my great-great-grandfather, Enos Julius DeWeese of Macon County, North Carolina, and later Gilmore County, Georgia. And that concludes my presentation. And I'll be happy to answer any questions, which I suspect you probably have, and just didn't come up.
So Meg asked a question in the chat. She sent it to me that said, can you discuss the issue of pileups with DNA testing that may give you false positive matches?
I'm not sure what the person means by pileups.
I'm not quite sure either. But have you run into maybe false positive matches?
Well, the DNA does not lie. So I could say that. It does not, however, ever tell you how you relate to somebody. So I know I'm related to I was related actually to Roger. He and I shared John Howland as a collective ancestor who came on the Mayflower. Well, probably neither of us has much John Howland DNA left. So there might be false negatives when you're looking at somebody far enough back. I'm not familiar at all with the idea of having false positives in DNA. But certainly we have had false positives in terms of identifying our ancestors and find that there has been a misattribution of parenthood. Okay, Karen has a question. Go ahead, Karen.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting, Rick. And I'm just wondering, you made the comment that it was not so bad because you only had to go back 2 generations. So my question is it even worth bothering going back 8 generations?
Did you say 8 generations?
Yes.
That would be someone who would have been probably a 7th cousin. You are not going to get very much DNA match there. And it's certainly not going to be, you're going to get a whole lot of other people in the mix. And maybe these are the false positives that somebody was referring to, that match you in that same area. And there may, 8 generations is a whole lot of research. So I'm not sure what you could do with that. Anything beyond about 5th cousins is going to be pretty challenging. What the 2 generations referred to actually was starting with the couple that were born in 1800. I only had to work forward 2 generations. If Jesse, for example, trying to find the identity of his father's parents had that small amount of DNA to deal with, he would have been looking at literally hundreds of people. My group was much smaller than that. I think I managed to compress it all into several pages of notes, but certainly it's basically Henry and Betsy's children and grandchildren, because by the time you got to the next generation, those kids would have been much too young. And was there another question that popped up?
Meg posted a link in the chat, and she said in a message, I just read about it recently. There are areas that are not very specifically tested, and they tend to pile up to give you a match with less than 1%. And then the link that she sent was a wiki entry to.
All right, let me read her messages from Meg.
Okay, I was gonna say.
Now I see that it came through. Regions of DNA in which there are not much variation leads to false segment matching with those you likely do not have a genetic or genealogical relationship with. I see. So she's all right. I see what she's talking about now. Identical by descent. There are areas in which you might, this, I've not heard it referred to as a false positive, but I think I understand the question now. There are areas of DNA, as she says here, that are so prevalent in a group that people are matching not by descent, but by, I forget what the other term is, just because everybody has that. So if you mention an area where, say, like the people in Iceland who were very heavily into genetics, they all match each other. So it gets very complicated over there. This also comes up with people that belong to certain ethnic groups. And it's very hard if you have endogamy, which is multiple marriages within a group, to ferret out which line you are descended from, because a lot of different people's DNA is mixed up in there together. That happens to a lesser degree in places like Macon County, but there are enough people there and enough different lines that you can usually figure out one way or the other, although you may find out that you're related to 3 or 4 different people in different ways, because one married into that family, and then later on, a couple of generations later, another ancestor married into the same family, and so forth. I hope that answers the question, and if not, try it again. Anyone else? All right, Karen.
Yes, I'm just following up on this URL that Meg sent. I'm not sure I understand what it represents or where it takes you. Is that what you just explained, that these are close?
What I tried to explain, yes. This is the International Society. it's genetic genealogy, and I don't remember it's ISOGG, and I forget the exact letters for the acronym, but it's an international group of genetic genealogy experts. And this is a wiki, which means it's basically, it's like the Wikipedia, but only for genetics. And this link would take you to the definition of that identical by descent, which means you have the same, you have a match with that person because you are both descended from a common ancestor.
Okay.
Again, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the term for people that the other way that you can be have the same.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Nat.
Hi, thanks very much. It was a great presentation.
Thank
I might have missed it, but did you mentioned you found descendants, other descendants of Enos Deweese, his children from his known marriage, and did they show up on your results as matching with DNA, or is that something that you might do in the future?
No, they did. They were on a list of matches from Ancestry, which if you recall, so they tested at Ancestry. These are living individuals who are descendants of his. And presumably they're probably going to match me in that same chromosome 2 location. But Ancestry doesn't permit that kind of discernment. I could contact each of them, but I'm not sure what the point would be.
Yeah.
You know, was your great-grandfather a philanderer?
Yeah, probably not interested in sharing that.
Yeah.
No, and it was, lastly, it was the position of the match that sort of got you started with this, that you had other matches, but not in that particular chromosome with the first gentleman, that led you down this research.
Well, it was actually the matches in that place that made the difference.
Okay.
So again, the term for that is called triangulation.
Yeah.
So I match Patrick and I match Nancy, and Patrick and Nancy match each other, which suggests that all of us are descended from somebody.
Right.
Back a ways. You can probably get an idea of how far back by looking at the size of the match, which is 25 centimorgans, and we're matching like 5 generations back or 6. And the fact that all 3 of us have DNA in that specific area, and in fact, usually the overlap is a little bit wilder. So this is it's a chunk of DNA that has persisted over lots of reproduction. So clearly we share some common ancestor, working their family trees back, because my family tree did not include my great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, but working theirs back, both Nancy and Patrick descended from Caroline Deweese. So that really kind of narrowed it down.
Great, thanks.
Anyone else?
Hi, Rick, can you hear me?
Yes.
The voice behind the computer.
I
So,
recognize the voice.
we have done a lot with the online resources. We, as you know, have dabbled in the DNA. I was intrigued that you started out with one DNA program and then uploaded to a different DNA program.
Yes.
And then you went back to the traditional research methods. We have some walls, if you will, and again, my totally out of my comfort zone is the DNA. We've done it, but to understand it. We also went farther and did a maternal line and a paternal line for each of them. But I guess what might be another course recommendation, we've done a couple of different DNA tests. I never thought to upload it to the different schools, but we're kind of 3 or 4 generations back. And as Mom said, Rick has certainly done, a lot of legwork in trying to just, to thread out those teeny little matches and as you said, thousands of files that you're going through to find your Nancy and your Patrick and your the other person. So anyway, other directions that you might point us in?
Well, let me first go back to the maternal and paternal lines that you mentioned. For the benefit of the folks that are not familiar with that, that is a different type of DNA. Mitochondrial DNA, which traces only from the mother's side. So you get your mitochondrial, no matter whether you're a male or a female, from your mother's mother, etc. The Y DNA passes only through the male. So each of us who are male got our Y DNA from our father. Females have no Y DNA. But of course, in our society, at least, males typically carry on the same surname. So there are lots of surname studies of Y DNA trying to figure out which Davis I'm related to and which one of those two brothers from 250 years ago is the one that's my ancestor. The Y DNA doesn't change nearly as much as the other stuff. Now, getting back to the strategies, the general recommendation is usually to test everywhere you can. So the thing is that I started with family tree DNA, and I quickly changed or transferred that same DNA over to MyHeritage. And as I said, I got 3 times as many matches there of people who had tested there, but not at family tree. And then Ancestry, that is, I have not tested at 23andMe for a number of reasons, but Ancestry is the big gorilla of the group. They have probably 10 times as many people tested there as the others. But again, they lack that chromosome map. So it's more challenging to dig into the weeds, and you get lots and lots and lots of matches. But some of their tools are kind of nice. You can hone in on matches. Again, you need to supplement that with the traditional research. I was looking at one of the supposed family matches from MyHeritage, which has the same kind of thing today. And I have no idea where they got the family tree that they were patching together from one source and another source and another source. I matched that person's DNA, but not on the family tree they had, because there was a jump in there. So I don't know what that's all about, but for the most part, it's a big clue. And for problems like Jesse's or mine, it's a godsend because it really points you in a direction. I had no clue starting with just traditional research because I was starting with a 0. No idea who the father was. So did I see another question come up? Oh, someone asked about using GEDmatch. I have used GEDmatch a lot, and I can just describe that in a second. Well, let me describe it first. GEDmatch takes your DNA that you've tested already, and it is an attempt to put together DNA from all of the different services. So if I tested Ancestry only, I can put my DNA in there into GEDmatch. And if somebody else tests only at family tree DNA, they can put theirs in there. And this stuff is on digital file. It's not, that's why you don't have to take another test. It's a group of numbers and locations. So they put those together so they can identify people that you match in an area where you haven't even tested. I'm sorry, an area where, yes, if you have not tested in that other service, they will find someone over there that you match. However, obviously they miss everybody who doesn't upload their results to GEDmatch. So it's a much narrower group of people. Most of them do not have family trees up, and without family trees, the fact that I might match with Yo-Yo Ma, say, does not help me a lot if I don't have Yo-Yo's tree so that I can go back enough generations to find where we might match. As far as I know, I do not match him. But I do match an awful lot of people, but I have a lot of people, especially from Ancestry, that I have no clue on what line they are, because I don't have other matches in that same area that I can identify. Like when I matched Patrick, it just told me he's from Macon County. But then when Nancy came along, I traced both of them back and they both had trees, and then I could find it. Because I know I was also descended from one of those. So does that answer I hope that answers the question and doesn't confuse everybody else too much. More questions?
Yes, I have a follow-up question.
Okay.
And the GED match was really helpful too. Thank you for that. Did I hear you were shying away from 23andMe? And I asked that specifically because I've done 23andMe. I also chose to do the health component, although I haven't done a lot with it. So I'm just, maybe if you don't want to share in the Zoom, maybe you can message me later about why.
No, I'd be happy to give you my opinion. I'm almost always happy to give you my opinion. I didn't test with 23andMe or use them early because their focus was really at that point much more on the health aspects, what DNA you share that might point toward various illnesses. I don't know, Kathy, is that you at Meg? You're not the same? I don't recognize that name. Anyway, so at that time also, they did not have a facility for using family trees. So their focus, again, was on health, not necessarily matching for genealogy, and they didn't have family trees up. So I was not interested in pursuing that. They have a smaller component of people that have tested there than I think any of the other three have. Although they might be catching up with family tree, which is the smallest of the other three. But when I tested with Ancestry and got how many ever thousand new hits that I got there, that gave me, well, welcome to the group, Meg. Thank you for your answer. Kathy has 3 screens going, so I wasn't sure if you were one of them. When I matched in Ancestry, that gave me plenty of things to work with without going to 23andMe. So that's why. There's nothing wrong with 23andMe. And if you do test there, I would recommend you go to GEDmatch because that would generate at least some matches from the other places. If you choose not to upload your results from 23andMe to the other services.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I got a question.
Yes,
First
Jesse.
of all, Rick, you did a great job. I really enjoyed it, and
Thank you.
hats off to you. How about those deadbeat dads? They give us a lot of work, don't they? And I've got a few of my own that I'm still working
Yes.
on. But with in relation to Enos's descendants that you've matched on Ancestry, did you notice, did you look at the amount of shared centimorgans? I know they don't have a chromosome browser, but did you look at the amount of shared centimorgans, and did you see that they were on the closer to the range that you would expect from that relationship?
That's an excellent question, Jesse. And let me just answer that by looking at a little chart I have here. And the answer is, unfortunately, the match is so far back that you can't be very precise. Remember, I said there's a total of about 7,000 centimorgans in the testing pool. So if, like say, you, Jesse, were looking for a grandparent, your grandparent probably matches you on average 1,750 centimorgans. Huge number. But your 5th cousin only matches you with 25. So unfortunately, the average for a 4th cousin is 35. The average for a first cousin, a fifth cousin once removed is 21. And the range in all of those goes all the way down to 0 up to as much as over 100. So if I match somebody and it says, like with Patrick, I matched him with, I believe it was 25 centimorgans. That could be any of a number of relationships, and there are tools around that will tell you the probabilities of those relationships. In other words, you can plug in the number, and this one of the places to do this, by the way, is a site called DNA Painter, which is a subject for another whole discussion. But you can plug that number 25 in there and it will tell you, well, you have a 22% probability that it is your third cousin, fourth cousin once removed, great, great, great uncle, et cetera, et cetera. They'll give you a whole group. And then there'll be another, say, 15% probability that is something a little closer or a little further back, because those little numbers in there, there are so many different permutations of ways that you can descend from a great great grandparent that you may have wide range. I've seen it within brothers going back just like 3 generations before, and it'd be widely different amounts of DNA that they inherited from a particular ancestor. Just the luck of the draw, as it were. So yes, I looked at that and I was hopeful of that, but the numbers are so small that it wasn't definitive in any way. Good question.
Thank you, Rick. And just to follow up to that, I don't know, maybe more of a comment than anything. I understand it's a little tricky when you're trying to to solve something where there may have been something out of wedlock, where maybe somebody wasn't faithful. But just my experience and what I've run into is, you're talking about something that happened 150 years ago. And so you may not get as bad a reception as you think from contacting some of Enos's descendants and just kind of throwing it out there and seeing if they would be interested in transferring to GEDmatch. You may find another genealogy not like us in his descendants who thinks this is a great mystery to try and solve. So just throwing it out there, but it is a little tricky. Nobody wants to think, like you had said at the beginning of the session, nobody wants to think that our ancestors are anything less than pure and honorable and noble and so on and so forth. But the longer I do this, the more I find out that humans have been flawed from the beginning. So
let me respond to that then, and I understand what you're saying. And I have written in several different cases to people, and I guess I'm not a very good correspondent because many times I don't get an answer back if it's a sort of a shot in the dark kind of thing. I have written a number of contacts saying, oh, it looks like we're like second cousins and so forth. And those people, then I usually send a 7-generation tree so they can look at ancestors by name and by location. And they will come back and say, well, yes, that's my great grandfather or whatever. But it's usually closer than that, because the people I would be contacting are, like me, a 5th-generation descendant. And of course, they would have no clue about what Enos was doing, Christmas Eve of 1869. I'm sure that is something that, if he is indeed the party, I'm sure that wasn't passed down through the family. There's a good chance that even his wife did not know. And remember, Adeline carefully kept that secret. And I have a feeling if he is the one, that was a big part of it. He's married, he has a family. They were childhood friends, maybe even childhood buddies, or who knows what. And, there may have been alcohol involved or whatever. The best spin I could put on it was not a non-consensual relationship, but it did result in a pregnancy, and she did her best to respect the father of her child, and probably never have any kind of definitive proof, but I sure got a lot of DNA evidence.
well, good luck, Rick. And once again, you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? ordinarily would be time for everybody to take a break and go have some great snacks. I encourage you to do that, but I don't think Sharon has anything laid out at the library for us. So you may have to paw around in your own kitchen to find something to follow up with. And let me remind everyone that the November, I got a couple more questions before I sign off. In November, we're going to have our show and tell, so be sure to bring something interesting. And it could be, we've had spoons, we've had paintings, we've had documents, we've had handwritten family trees. So a wide variety of people and a wide variety of things, and don't be shy. We're all interested in all of it. Let me go back to these last questions here. Yes, somebody's asking about the group projects. I take it that that is somebody who has tested Y-DNA. I have now actually done that. Unfortunately, in my particular case, the Y-DNA, remember, you're likely to get people with the same last name. And the idea is to distinguish which of the different people you descend from. In my particular case, Davis is a very common name. I've encountered Davises in New England, not mine. I've encountered Davises in the South, like in North Carolina, not mine. My Davises are actually Germans who were in Pennsylvania Dutch country and then migrated westward as others have done. It was originally something close to Dewees, actually. D-E-W-E-S was the way it was spelled in German, pronounced Davis. The W being pronounced like a V, like in Auf Wiedersehen or Volkswagen. No, that's actually folk, so forget that. But it was written as D-E-W-E-S, but pronounced like a V. And after a couple generations, it just became Davis in English. I'm in the Davis group on Family Tree DNA. There are well over 1,000, I believe, people in that group. I am not related to any of them. No other of those ancestors have had their Y-DNA tested. But I have concluded where that DNA comes from because of using the regular DNA and regular traditional research as I've just described to you. And I know with great confidence that I'm descended from this particular family in Pennsylvania that come from St. Martin's, Germany, in the Saar. So does that answer all the questions?
I think so. Thank you, Rick. That was great.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for coming.